She stepped onto the dusty platform of Blackwater Ridge, with a wedding dress stained in coal dust, and a left arm hanging at a sickening, unnatural angle. Adelaide Vance wasn't the sturdy, capable mail-order bride Thaddeus Mercer had paid $20 for. She was a broken bird running from a hawk. But when Thaddeus looked into her eyes, he didn't see a victim. He saw a fire that terrified him. Why was she injured before she even arrived? And who was the man in the black duster watching the train leave? Watch how a rugged cowboy becomes the only salvation for a woman hunted by her past, and why a broken bone was just the beginning of a love worth killing for. The noon sun over the Wyoming Territory didn't just shine. It hammered the earth until the dirt turned to powder and the air shimmered like a mirage. Thaddeus Mercer leaned against the support post of the Blackwater Ridge train depot, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes. He wasn't a man given to nervousness, but the sweat trickling down his spine had nothing to do with the heat. In his pocket sat a crumpled letter read so many times, the ink was fading. Adelaide Vance, 24 years of age, strong of back sound of mind and willing to work a hard land. Thad needed strong of back. The Mercer Ranch, 3,000 acres of scrub grass and stubborn cattle, was hanging by a thread. His father had died 2 winters ago, leaving Thad with debts, a half-collapsed barn, and a silence in the house so loud it sometimes kept him awake. He didn't need romance. He needed a partner who could pluck a chicken mend a fence and endure the brutal isolation without losing her wits. The iron horse shrieked in the distance, a metal beast tearing through the silence of the plains. "She coming today, Thad?" Thad glanced at the station master, an old man named Amos, who chewed tobacco like it was his job. "Supposed to," Thad grunted, straightening up. He brushed the dust off his vest. He wanted to look presentable, even if he felt like a fraud in his Sunday shirt. The train hissed into the station brakes, squealing steam billowing out to mix with the dust. The doors clanged open. A few salesmen stepped off, followed by a family of settlers looking bewildered. Then she appeared. Thad's breath hitched, but not for the reason he expected. The woman, standing at the top of the stairs, was pale. Her skin the color of old parchment. She was small. Too small, Thad thought immediately, with dark hair escaping a bonnet that had seen better days. But it was the way she stood that froze him. She was leaning heavily against the doorframe, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her left arm was cradled against her chest, held there by her right hand. As she took the first step down, she stumbled. "Whoa there!" Thad surged forward, catching her just before she hit the dirt. The impact of his hands on her waist made her cry out a sharp, ragged sound that cut through the station noise. She recoiled, her eyes flying open. They were green, wide with panic, and darting around the platform like a trapped animal. "Don't touch me," she hissed, though her voice was trembling. Thad stepped back, hands raised. "I'm Thaddeus Mercer, ma'am. You wrote me." "Adelaide." She blinked, focusing on him. The fear didn't leave her face, but it changed, hardening into something desperate. "Thaddeus," she whispered. She tried to straighten up to look the part of the sturdy bride he'd been promised, but a spasm of pain crossed her face and she doubled over. Thad looked at her arm. The sleeve of her simple grey travelling dress was torn near the elbow. Beneath the fabric, the limb was swollen, twisted at an angle that turned Thad's stomach. "Your arm," Thad said, his voice dropping. "That ain't right, ma'am. That's broke." "It happened on the train," Adelaide lied. Thad could tell it was a lie. The bruising blooming around her wrist was dark purple and yellow. That was hours old, maybe a day. "I fell. The luggage rack. A valise fell." "A valise did that?" Thad looked at her skeptically. "Are you going to stand there and judge me, Mr. Mercer, or are you going to help me?" She gritted her teeth, sweat beading on her upper lip. "If you don't want me, say so, but don't leave me standing in the open." She looked over her shoulder at the train, specifically at the caboose where the conductor was signaling departure. Her gaze was terrified. Thad narrowed his eyes. She wasn't just hurt. She was hunting for an exit. He should send her back. A ranch wife with a broken arm was a liability he couldn't afford. He had cattle to move next week. He had a roof to fix. He didn't have time to nurse an invalid who lied to him within the first minute. But then he looked at her boots. They were fine leather city boots, scuffed and worn down to the nub, but expensive ones. And he looked at her hand, the one clutching the broken arm. There were no calluses. This woman had never worked a hard land in her life. "Get the wagon," Thad muttered to himself, cursing his own softness. "What?" "I said, let's get you to the wagon," Thad said louder. "Doc Miller is 3 streets over. We need to set that before the swelling gets worse." "No doctor," she said quickly, too quickly. I can't afford a doctor, and I don't want to cause a scene." "You're already a scene, Miss Vance," Thad said dryly, gesturing to Amos, who was staring openly. "And I'm paying." "No." She grabbed his forearm with her good hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please, no doctors, no names on ledgers. Can you do it? You're a rancher. You fix things." Thad stared at her. "There's a difference between splinting a calf's leg and setting a woman's arm, Adelaide." "Bone is bone," she whispered, swaying on her feet. "Please, take me to your home. If you send me to a doctor, I'll leave. I'll get on the next train, and you'll never see me again." It was an ultimatum that made no sense unless she was hiding from the law, or something worse. Thad looked at the train now chugging away, disappearing into the vast western horizon. He looked back at this fragile, broken woman who was currently the only prospect he had for a future that wasn't lonely and cold. "Fine," Thad grunted. "But you and I are going to have a long talk about what really happened to that arm." He reached out, not to grab her, but to offer support. "Can you walk?" She nodded, biting her lip until it bled. "I can walk." She couldn't. She made it 3 steps before her knees buckled. Thad caught her again, and this time he didn't ask. He scooped her up into his arms, mindful of the shattered left side. She was light, dangerously so. She smelled of coal smoke, lavender water, and the metallic tang of fear. As he carried her toward the buckboard wagon, Thad felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck. He turned his head, scanning the station one last time. Standing by the water tower, half hidden in the shadows, was a man. He wore a suit that was too nice for Blackwater Ridge and a bowler hat. He wasn't looking at the train. He was watching Thaddeus carry Adelaide. Thad stared back, his jaw tightening. The man tipped his hat turned and walked away toward the telegraph office. "Trouble," Thad whispered to the unconscious woman in his arms. "You brought me trouble, didn't you, Addie?" The ride to the Mercer Ranch took 2 hours. Thaddeus drove the wagon slower than he ever had in his life, wincing every time the wheels hit a rut, knowing it jarred the woman lying in the back. He had made a bed of grain sacks and his own duster coat, but the road was unforgiving. Adelaide drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time she woke, she didn't scream. She just gasped a sharp intake of air that sounded like a sob. When they finally rolled under the wooden arch of the ranch gate, the sign reading Mercer. Leaning crookedly to the left, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. Thad carried her into the main house. It was a sturdy log structure built by his grandfather, but the inside was sparse. A large stone fireplace, a heavy oak table, and dust motes dancing in the fading light. He bypassed the guest room and took her straight to his room. It was the only one with a bed that had a proper mattress. He'd sleep in the bunkhouse tonight. He laid her down. She was awake now, her eyes glassy with pain. "Whiskey," Thad said. It wasn't a question. He went to the cabinet and pulled out a bottle of rye and 2 glasses. He poured one for her, filled to the brim, and a shot for himself. He downed his in one burn, then brought the glass to her lips. "Drink, all of it." She choked on the first sip, coughing, which jarred her arm and made her cry out. "Easy," Thad murmured. His voice was lower now, lacking the gruffness from the station. He sat on the edge of the bed. "You need this. It's gonna hurt, Addie. I ain't gonna lie to you." She managed to swallow half the glass. The alcohol brought a flush to her pale cheeks. "Do it," she whispered. "Just do it." Thad took a knife from his belt. "I have to cut the sleeve." She nodded. He worked carefully, slicing the heavy wool of the dress. When the fabric fell away, Thad hissed through his teeth. The forearm was swollen to twice its size, the skin stretched tight and shiny. The bone hadn't broken the skin, thank God. But it was displaced. A clean break, but a bad one. And there were fingerprints. Dark bruises in the shape of fingers were wrapped around her upper arm, just above the elbow. Someone had grabbed her. Hard. And then snapped the bone. Thad looked at her face. She was watching him, waiting for the judgment. "This wasn't a valise," Thad said quietly. "Does it matter?" she asked, her voice slurring slightly from the rye. "It matters if the man who made these marks is coming here." She closed her eyes. "He isn't coming. I lost him in St. Louis." St. Louis is a long way away, but the train tracks run both directions. Thad stood up and went to the wash basin. He scrubbed his hands with a lye soap until they were raw. He grabbed some clean linen strips he kept for emergencies and 2 smooth slats of cedar wood he'd planned to use for shingle repairs. He returned to the bed. "I need you to trust me." Adelaide looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by wind and sun. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow and eyes the color of slate. He looked dangerous. But his hands. As he prepared the splints, his hands were steady. "I trust you," she lied. She didn't trust anyone, but she had no choice. "I'm going to have to pull it to get the bones straight," Thad said. He positioned himself, placing one hand on her elbow and the other grasping her wrist. "I need you to focus on my voice. Look at me." She locked eyes with him. "I promise, gentleness, Addie," he said softly. "After this part, after the pain, I promise you no one is going to hurt you here. I swear it on my father's grave." "Okay," she whispered. "On 3. 1, 2. He pulled on 2. Adelaide screamed. It was a raw, primal sound that echoed off the timber walls. Her back arched off the mattress, her vision going white. Thad didn't let go. He felt the bone grate, then slip back into alignment with a sickening clunk. He held the traction, sweating profusely, while he quickly slapped the cedar slats on either side and began winding the linen. Tighter. Tighter. Adelaide had stopped screaming. She had passed out. Thad finished tying the knot. He sat back, his chest heaving, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He looked at her limp form. Her face was peaceful now, the lines of pain smoothed out by unconsciousness. He gently lifted her head and placed a pillow beneath it. He found a quilt at the foot of the bed and covered her, tucking it under her chin. "Who did this to you?" Thad whispered into the quiet room. He traced the bruises on her upper arm with a hovering finger, not daring to touch. He walked out onto the porch and lit a cheroot, his hands finally shaking. The sun was gone. The prairie was dark. He thought about the man in the bowler hat at the station. Thad walked to the gun rack by the door. He took down his Winchester 1873 repeater, checked the chamber, and levered a round in. Then he took his Colt peacemaker from its holster, spun the cylinder, and placed it on the table near the door. He wasn't a gunman. He was a rancher. But tonight, Thaddeus Mercer felt like a sentry guarding a fortress. For 3 days, Adelaide existed in a fever dream. She floated in a haze of pain and whiskey. Sometimes, she saw a man with kind grey eyes spooning broth into her mouth. Sometimes, she saw him, Arthur, standing at the foot of the bed, holding the heavy brass cane he used to discipline her. "You think you can leave me? Addie, you belong to the syndicate. You belong to me." She would wake up thrashing, crying out, only to feel a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. "Easy. You're safe. You're at the Mercer spread." By the 4th morning, the fever broke. Adelaide woke up to the smell of frying bacon and coffee. Strong black coffee. She blinked, staring at a ceiling made of rough-hewn logs. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The pain in her arm was a dull throb, now weighed down by the heavy splint and bandages. She tried to sit up, but her body felt like lead. "I wouldn't move too fast," a voice rumbled. Thaddeus was standing in the doorway. He looked different than she remembered from the station. He wasn't wearing the Sunday vest. He wore a faded blue work shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and dusty denim trousers. He looked tired. "Mr. Mercer," she croaked. Her throat felt like it was full of sand. "Thad, just Thad." He walked over, carrying a tin cup. "Water first." He helped her sit up, adjusting the pillows behind her back with a care that surprised her. He held the cup while she drank greedily. "Thank you," she said, wiping her mouth. She looked down at her arm. The splint was neat, professional. You did this?" "I did. Doc Miller rode out yesterday to check it. Said he couldn't have done better himself. Said you're lucky to keep the arm." Adelaide looked away. "I suppose I am." He also asked how it happened. Thad pulled a chair over and sat down. "I told him a horse kicked you. A lie for a lie, Miss Vance." Adelaide stiffened. "It wasn't entirely a lie. I did fall. Did. After someone broke your arm." Thad's eyes were intense, searching. "You talked in your sleep, Addie. You mentioned a name. Arthur." The colour drained from her face so fast, Thad thought she might faint again. "He's my former employer," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Employer. You dress like high society, but your hands are soft. You ain't a maid. You ain't a cook. What kind of work did you do for Arthur?" Adelaide looked at Thad. She saw the judgment forming in his eyes. She knew what he was thinking. A woman alone, running from a man dressed in finery, but with no money. "I was a pianist," she said. It was the truth. In a parlour in St. Louis. Arthur owned the establishment. A saloon, a gentleman's club, high stakes, expensive drinks. She lifted her chin defiantly. "I played the piano, that is all. But Arthur, he believed he owned everything in that building, the tables, the whiskey, and the people." She looked down at her broken arm. "He wanted me to play for a private party. A man who liked to hurt things. I refused. Arthur didn't like no. He grabbed me. He twisted. He said if I wouldn't play for his guests, I wouldn't play for anyone." She held up her left hand, the fingers swollen and useless in the splint. "I'll never play again." The silence in the room was heavy. Thad looked at her hand, then at her face. He saw the grief there, not just for the pain, but for the music. "So you ran," Thad said. "I hit him with a bottle. I took money from the safe, my wages, what he owed me, and I ran to the train station. I saw your advertisement in the paper a week before. I answered it on a whim. I never thought I'd actually come." "Why did you?" "Because Arthur has friends everywhere in the city. The West. This was the only place empty enough to hide." Thad stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the rolling hills of his ranch. It ain't empty, Addie. It's just quiet. And secrets. They make a lot of noise out here. He turned back to her. You can stay. You can heal. But you need to know something. This ranch, it's failing. I have a mortgage payment due in 2 months to the bank in Cheyenne. If I don't make it, we lose everything. I needed a wife to help me work the land, to cook for the hands to keep the garden. With that arm, you can't do any of that. Adelaide felt a spike of shame. I can learn. I can cook with one hand. You can't, he said bluntly. Not yet. So here's the deal. You stay. You heal. I'll protect you from this Arthur if he comes sniffing around. But you handle the books. You said you took money from a safe. That means you can count. You can read. My education, it stopped at 12. He gestured to a pile of chaotic ledgers on the desk in the corner. My father left a mess. The bank says we're under, but I think they're cheating me. I can't prove it. You find the money in those books, Addie. You save this ranch with your mind, and I'll save you with my gun. Deal. Adelaide looked at the ledgers. It was a lifeline, a way to be useful. Deal, she whispered. Good. Thad put his hat on. I got cattle to check. There's stew on the stove. Don't open the door for anyone but me. He walked out, his spurs jingling. Adelaide watched him go. She felt a strange sensation in her chest. It wasn't love. It was too soon, too raw for that. It was safety. But safety was an illusion. Later that afternoon, Adelaide was sitting at the table, struggling to turn the pages of a ledger with one hand when she heard a horse approach. She froze. Thad had said he'd be gone until sundown. She crept to the window, staying low. It wasn't Thad. A man on a black horse had stopped at the gate. He was wearing a bowler hat. He took a piece of paper out of his pocket, looked at it, then looked at the house. Adelaide's heart stopped. She recognized the man. It wasn't Arthur. It was Silas. No, not Silas. It was Mr. Griggs, Arthur's cleaner, the man who tracked down debtors and thieves. He didn't come to the door. He simply sat on his horse, staring at the house for a long, agonizing minute. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward town. He knew. Adelaide slid down the wall to the floor, clutching her broken arm. She had brought the devil to Thaddeus Mercer's doorstep. The next 2 weeks settled into a tense, quiet rhythm. Thad was out before dawn and back after dark, smelling of horse sweat and exhaustion. Adelaide, or Addie, as he'd started calling her, waged war on the ledgers. She was good at it. Better than she expected. As she deciphered the scrawled entries of Thad's late father, she began to see a pattern. The Mercer Ranch wasn't just failing. It was being bled dry. There were payments for feed that never arrived, fees for grazing rights on land the Mercers already owned, and exorbitant interest rates from the Ironwood Bank. The bank manager, a man named Elias Thorne, seemed to be the architect of their ruin. One evening, while Thad was sharpening his knife by the fire, Addie spoke up. "Thad, look at this." He looked up weary. "Bad news. Strange news. You paid for 20 head of cattle last October from the Miller spread." "Yeah, we needed new breeding stock. The ledger says you paid $400, but the receipt from the bank draft says $600. Thad frowned. He put the knife down and walked over, leaning over her shoulder. He smelled of wood smoke and sage, a scent Addie found increasingly comforting. "Show me." She pointed to the discrepancy. "And here, repair supplies. The bill from the general store is for $12. The withdrawal from your account was for $50. Thad's face darkened. "Elias Thorne handles my accounts. He said he was auto-deducting the expenses to save me the trips to town. He's stealing from you, Thad, nickel and diming you into bankruptcy so he can foreclose." Thad slammed his fist on the table, making Addie jump. That snake I'll ride into town tomorrow and do what? Addie interrupted, her voice sharp. Shoot him. Then you hang and the bank takes the ranch anyway. We need proof. We need his personal ledger, the one he keeps at the bank. Thad looked at her, impressed. You got a criminal mind, Addie. I survived a criminal world, Thad. Their eyes met. The tension that had been simmering between them, the unspoken attraction, the shared living space, flared up. Thad reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. You're more than I bargained for, Addie Vance, he murmured. Is that a bad thing? She breathed. He leaned in. His lips were inches from hers. Addie's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted this. She wanted to forget Arthur, the broken arm, the fear. Bang, bang, bang. Someone was pounding on the front door. Thad pulled back instantly, his hand dropping to the Colt at his hip. He signaled for Addie to get behind the fireplace. Who is it? Thad bellowed. Sheriff Brady, came the muffled reply. Open up, Mercer. Thad relaxed slightly, but didn't take his hand off his gun. He opened the door. Sheriff Brady, a portly man with a walrus moustache, stood there looking uncomfortable. Behind him stood Mr. Griggs. Addie gasped from the shadows. Evening, Thad, the sheriff said, taking off his hat. Sorry to disturb you. This gentleman here, Mr. Griggs, is a private detective from St. Louis. He's looking for a woman. Says she stole a considerable sum of money and might be hiding out as a mail-order bride. Griggs stepped forward. He had a face like a ferret, sharp and unsmiling. She's a thief, Mr. Mercer, and a fugitive. We believe she goes by the name Adelaide. We tracked her trunk to the depot. Thad didn't blink. He blocked the doorway with his broad frame. I got a housekeeper, Sheriff, but her name is Sarah, and she ain't from St. Louis. She's from Chicago. Griggs narrowed his eyes. May we see her? No, Thad said flatly. She's asleep, and I don't take kindly to strangers waking up my household. Mr. Mercer, Griggs said, his voice silky. Harboring a fugitive is a crime. If she's here and you're lying, I ain't lying, Thad said, his voice dropping to a growl. Now get off my porch before I decide you're trespassing. The sheriff put a hand on Griggs's chest. Thad's a good man, Griggs. If he says she ain't here, she ain't here. Let's go check the boarding house in town again. Griggs stared at Thad for a long moment. Then his eyes flicked past Thad into the dark room. Addie pressed herself against the cold stone of the chimney, holding her breath. Very well, Griggs said. But if you see her, Mr. Mercer, she's dangerous, a manipulator. Don't believe a word she says. They turned and walked back to their horses. Thad closed the door and bolted it. He turned around. Addie stepped out of the shadows, shaking. He knows, she whispered. He didn't believe you. I know, Thad said grimly. We got maybe a day before he comes back with a warrant or a posse. I have to leave, Addie said, tears welling up. I can't drag you into this. Thad crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed her shoulders, the good one, and her waist. You ain't going nowhere. You're the only one who can figure out Thorne's books, and I ain't letting you go back to Arthur. Why? She cried. I'm nothing but trouble. Maybe I like trouble, Thad said fiercely. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Addie melted into him, her good arm wrapping around his neck. For a moment, the broken bone, the debts and the hitman outside didn't matter. When they broke apart, Thad rested his forehead against hers. Tomorrow, he said, we go to town. We're gonna rob the bank. Addie stared at him. What? Not money? Thad said, a reckless grin spreading across his face. We're gonna steal Thorne's ledger. If we can prove he's cheating everyone in the valley, the sheriff will be too busy arresting him to worry about you. And if Griggs tries anything, well, accidents happen in the Wild West. It was insane. It was dangerous. "I'm in," Addie said. The morning sun over Blackwater Ridge did not offer warmth. It offered exposure. The town was waking up, merchants sweeping their boardwalks, horses stamping in the mud. To the casual observer, the buckboard wagon rolling down Main Street was just another rancher coming for supplies. But inside the wagon beneath the seat lay the Winchester rifle and the stolen ledgers from the Mercer ranch. Thaddeus pulled the reins, bringing the horses to a halt in front of the ironwood bank. It was the finest building in town, made of red brick imported from the east, standing like a fortress among the wooden shanties. "Are you ready?" Thad asked, not looking at her. He was scanning the rooftops, the alleyways. Adelaide adjusted her sling. She wore a heavy shawl to conceal the splint as much as possible. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I'm ready. Just remember, keep Thorne shouting. If he's shouting, he isn't looking at the back office." "I've wanted to shout at Elias Thorne for 2 years," Thad grunted. "That won't be hard." Thad hopped down and tied the horses. He helped Adelaide down. Her legs felt weak, but the adrenaline was acting as a potent painkiller. They walked into the bank together. The interior was cool and smelled of ink and old paper. A teller behind a brass cage looked up. Elias Thorne was seated at a mahogany desk in the open area, polishing his spectacles. He was a thin man with slicked-back hair and a suit that cost more than Thad's entire herd. "Mr. Mercer," Thorne said, not rising, "if you're here about the extension, I'm afraid the answer remains no. The bank requires payment by the 1st of the month." "I ain't here for an extension, Elias," Thad said, his voice booming. He walked straight to the desk, slamming his hand down. "I'm here to ask why you charged me for fencing wire I never ordered." Thorne blinked, flustered. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't play coy with me," Thad shouted. The teller jumped. A few customers near the door froze. "I have the receipts. You've been skimming off my account for months." While Thad drew the attention of the entire room, Adelaide slipped away. She moved toward the heavy oak door behind the teller cages marked private. This was where the real books were kept. She knew men like Thorne. They kept 2 sets of books, one for the auditors and one for themselves. She tried the handle. Locked. She glanced back. Thad was now leaning over Thorne's desk, his face red, pointing a finger in the banker's face. Thorne was standing up, sputtering indignantly. Adelaide reached into her hairpins. She pulled out a sturdy wire pin she had modified that morning. With her good hand, she jammed it into the lock. It was awkward, frustrating work. She needed 2 hands to apply tension, but she had to use her hip to press against the door while she jiggled the pin. Click. She slipped inside and closed the door softly. The room was dark, the blinds drawn, walls lined with filing cabinets. In the center, a large safe. It wasn't the main vault that was downstairs. This was a personal safe. "Come on," she whispered. She didn't know the combination, but she knew people. Thorne was arrogant. He wouldn't pick a random number. He would pick something that made him feel important. She tried his birthday. She had seen it on a certificate in the lobby. Nothing. She tried the date the bank opened. Nothing. Outside, she heard Thad yelling, "I want the sheriff. I want an audit." Panic clawed at her throat. She looked around the desk. There was a framed picture of a prize-winning horse. Thunderbolt, 1882. She spun the dial. 188200. The handle turned. Adelaide swung the heavy door open. Inside, stacked neatly, were bundles of cash and a black leather-bound ledger. She grabbed the book. She flipped it open. It was all there. Mercer account skimmed $50, adjusted to $12, pocketed difference. And not just Mercer. Miller Halloway Higgins. Half the town was in this book. "Got you," she whispered. "I believe," a smooth voice said from the shadows of the corner. "That doesn't belong to you, Miss Vance?" Adelaide froze. She turned slowly. Mr. Griggs was sitting in a leather armchair in the corner of the room, obscured by the darkness. He held a small Derringer pistol in his hand. "You're good," Griggs said, standing up. "Thorne didn't even know I was back here. I was waiting for him to finish his business so we could discuss acquisition fees. But finding you here, that saves me a trip to the ranch." "Let me go," Adelaide said, clutching the ledger to her chest with her broken arm, wincing at the pressure. "Thorne is a criminal. Look at the book." "I don't care about Thorne," Griggs said, stepping closer. "And Arthur doesn't care about the money you stole. It's the principle, Adelaide. You embarrassed him. And for that, I have to break the rest of you." He reached for her. Adelaide didn't think. She reacted. She swung the heavy ledger with her good hand, smashing it into Griggs' face. The corner of the book caught him in the eye. He roared in pain, the gun going off. Bang! The shot went wild, shattering a vase. The door burst open. Thad was there. He didn't ask questions. He saw Griggs. He saw the gun. Thad tackled Griggs, driving him into the bookshelf. Books rained down on them. Griggs was fast, slippery, but Thad was fighting with the rage of a man defending his life. He landed a heavy right hook to Griggs's jaw, knocking the detective senseless for a moment. "Run!" Thad yelled, grabbing Adelaide's arm, the good one, and pulling her. They burst out of the office. Thorne was screaming, "Robbery, robbery!" The sheriff was just entering the front door, drawn by the noise. "Stop them!" Thorne shrieked, pointing at Thad. "They robbed my safe!" Thad didn't stop to explain. He shoved past the confused sheriff, dragging Adelaide out the door. They scrambled into the wagon. Thad whipped the reins. "Hyah!" The horses surged forward. A bullet whizzed past Thad's ear, embedding itself in the wagon seat. Griggs was at the bank door, aiming a longer revolver now. "Get down!" Thad roared, pushing Adelaide's head down. The wagon careened around the corner wheels, skidding in the mud as they raced out of Blackwater Ridge, leaving a cloud of dust and chaos in their wake. They had the book. But now they had every gun in town behind them. They rode hard for 20 minutes until the horses were blown lather forming on their flanks. Thad pulled them off the main road into a narrow canyon that cut through the limestone cliffs, a shortcut to the ranch known only to the locals. He brought the wagon to a halt under an overhang. Silence returned to the plains, save for the heavy breathing of the horses. "You hit?" Thad asked, turning to Adelaide. His eyes were wild, scanning her for blood. "No," she gasped. "My arm. It hurts." Thad checked the splint. It had shifted slightly, but the bone seemed stable. "We can't go back to the ranch," he said grimly. "That's the first place they'll look. Griggs will deputize a posse. Thorne will pay for hired guns." "We have the book," Adelaide said, tapping the ledger inside her coat. "We have the proof." "Proof don't matter if you're dead before the judge sees it," Thad said. "The circuit judge isn't due in town until next week. Until then, Thorne is the law because he owns the sheriff. So what do we do?" Thad looked at the landscape. "We go to the high ground, the old trapper's cabin up on Eagle Peak. It's defensible. Only one way up." They abandoned the wagon, unhitched the horses, and rode bareback up the steep, rocky trail. It was agony for Adelaide, every jolt sending lightning through her shoulder. But she didn't complain. She bit her lip until it was raw. They reached the cabin by late afternoon. It was a rotting husk of timber, but the walls were thick logs. Thad immediately set to work. He boarded up the windows with loose planks, checked his ammunition, and positioned Adelaide in the corner with a clear view of the trail, but out of the line of fire. "Thad," Adelaide said softly, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in blood-red streaks. "You should leave me. Take the book, ride to Cheyenne, give it to the U.S. Marshals." Thad stopped loading his Winchester. He walked over and knelt beside her. "Is that what you think of me? That I'd leave you to Griggs? I'm a burden, Thad. I'm broken. You smashed a hitman in the face with a ledger." Thad smiled a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You ain't broken, Addie. You're just mending." He took her good hand and kissed the knuckles. "I ain't going nowhere. We make our stand here." Night fell. The darkness was absolute. Then they saw them, torches bobbing up the trail, the sound of hooves on stone. "They're coming," Thad whispered. He moved to the window, resting the rifle barrel on the sill. "Stay down. Come out, Mercer." It was Griggs's voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Give us the girl and the book, and you can keep your miserable life." Thad didn't answer. He waited. "Have it your way." A shot rang out, splintering the wood above Thad's head. The siege began. Bullets slammed into the cabin, punching through the rotting chinking between the logs. Thad returned fire, his shots calculated and precise. He wasn't shooting to kill. Not yet, he was shooting to suppress. He hit a rock near a horse, causing it to rear and throw its rider. "Thorne sent 5 men," Thad called out over the gunfire. "Plus Griggs." Adelaide huddled in the corner. She felt useless. She looked around the cabin. There was an old rusted stove, some firewood, and a box of blasting caps. No just old mining supplies. Kerosene. She crawled towards the lantern Thad had extinguished. "What are you doing?" Thad grunted, firing again. Ch-ch-ooh, bang. "I can't shoot," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "But I can shed some light on the situation." She grabbed a rag, soaked it in the kerosene from the lantern, and stuffed it into an empty whiskey bottle Thad had in his saddlebag. "A Molotov?" Thad asked, glancing back. "Where did a piano player learn that anarchists in St. Louis?" she said grimly. "Arthur had enemies." She crawled to the window. "Thad, cover me." "Addie, no." She stood up, lit the rag with a lucifer match, and threw it with her right arm. It sailed through the night air, arching over the rocks where Griggs and his men were taking cover. It smashed against a boulder, erupting in a ball of blue and orange flame. The horses screamed. The men shouted, scrambling back from the sudden inferno. "Now!" Thad yelled. He levered the Winchester rapidly. Bang, bang, bang. 2 of the hired guns went down, clutching their legs. The others broke cover, running down the trail. Only 1 man remained. Griggs. He didn't run. He advanced through the firelight, moving from rock to rock. He was calm, methodical. He was closing in. Thad clicked the trigger. Empty. He reached for his belt. He had 6 shots in the Colt. "Thad!" Addie screamed. Griggs had circled around. He was at the door. He kicked it open, the rotting wood giving way. He stood there, silhouetted by the burning brush outside, his gun raised. "End of the line, Miss Vance," Griggs sneered. Thad was too far away. He lunged, putting his body between Griggs and Adelaide. Blam! Thad jerked back, hitting the floor hard. A red stain blossomed on his shoulder. "No!" Adelaide shrieked. Griggs stepped into the room, leveling the gun at Thad's head. "An unfortunate casualty. Now the book." Adelaide looked at Thad, bleeding on the floor. She looked at Griggs, and then she looked at the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. She didn't have the strength to swing it. Her left arm was useless. Her right arm was weak. But she had her voice. "Arthur sent a telegram," she lied, screaming it. Griggs paused. "What? He sent a telegram to the sheriff in Cheyenne. He knows you're skimming off the top of the bounty. He knows you kept the money from the frantic job. It was a gamble, a pure, desperate fabrication based on what she knew of criminals. They never trusted each other." Griggs hesitated. For a split second, doubt flickered in his eyes. "You're lying." "Check your pocket watch," she yelled. "The inscription Arthur told me." Griggs instinctively glanced down his gun, lowering an inch. That inch was all Thaddeus needed. Thad, fighting through the shock of the bullet, whipped his Colt up from the floor. Bang! The shot hit Griggs square in the chest. The detective looked surprised. He took a step back, dropped his gun, and collapsed into the doorway, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling. Silence returned to the cabin. Adelaide scrambled over to Thad. Thad, look at me." He groaned, his face pale. Did we win? We won," she sobbed, pressing her hand against his wound. "You startle-headed cowboy, you saved me." "Part of the job," he whispered, his eyes closing. "Mail-order bride. Satisfaction guaranteed." The trial of Elias Thorne was the biggest event Wyoming had seen since statehood. With Griggs dead and the ledger in the hands of the U.S. Marshals, who arrived 2 days later, summoned by a suspicious telegraph operator who had overheard Thorne's panic, the house of cards collapsed. The ledger didn't just implicate Thorne. It exposed a ring of corruption that went all the way to the governor's aide. Thorne was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The Mercer Ranch debt was declared null and void due to fraudulent interest practices. But Thaddeus Mercer wasn't in the courtroom to hear the verdict. He was sitting on the porch of his ranch, his arm in a sling that mirrored Adelaide's. The bullet had passed through the muscle of his shoulder, clean, luckily, but painful. Adelaide came out of the house carrying 2 mugs of coffee. It had been 3 months. The cast on her arm was gone, replaced by a light brace. The bone had healed, though the doctor said it would always be a little crooked, a little stiff when the rain came. She set the coffee down and sat next to him on the swinging bench. The winter snow was beginning to melt, revealing the green grass of spring. "Sheriff says the auction for the bank's assets is next week," Thad said, staring at the horizon. "They're selling Thorne's fancy desk." "I don't need a desk," Adelaide said, blowing on her coffee. "I have the kitchen table. It works fine for the accounts." The ranch was turning around. With the debt gone and the stolen money returned to the accounts, Thad had hired 3 new hands. They were repairing the barn. The herd was growing. "I wasn't thinking about the desk," Thad said. He turned to look at her. "I was thinking about the piano." Adelaide froze. The piano. Thorne had a grand piano in his parlor, imported from France. Sheriff says it's going up for bid. Thad shifted awkwardly, wincing as his shoulder pulled. I got some money put aside. From the cattle drive." "Thad, I can't," Adelaide whispered, looking at her left hand. She flexed her fingers. They moved, but slowly. "I can't play like I used to. The speed, it's gone." "So play slow," Thad said simply. "I ain't in a rush." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. It wasn't new. The velvet was worn. "This was my mother's," Thad said. "She was a hard woman, but she loved this land. And she loved my father." He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold band with a small, rough-cut diamond. "Adelaide Vance." Thad said, his voice thick with emotion. "You came here broken. I was broke. We faced fire thieves and a bank run. I reckon if we can survive, that we can survive marriage." Adelaide looked at the ring, then at the man who had set her bone and saved her life. She realized that the fear she had carried from St. Louis was gone. Arthur wasn't coming. Griggs was buried in the pauper's field. She was free. "I'm not the sturdy woman you ordered," she said, tears spilling over. "I'm a city girl with a crooked arm and a criminal record. You're the woman who threw a Molotov cocktail to save my hide." Thad grinned. "I think that qualifies you as a rancher." She laughed, a sound that was light and free. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Thaddeus Mercer." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They sat on the porch as the sun went down, watching the shadows lengthen over the land that was finally truly theirs. Years later, people in Blackwater Ridge would talk about the Mercer place. They didn't talk about the cattle or the crops. They talked about the music. On summer nights, if the wind was right, you could hear a piano drifting across the plains. It wasn't fast, showy music. It was slow, sweet, and full of soul. It was the sound of a woman who had healed, played for a man who had listened. And it was the most beautiful sound in the West. What a journey. From a broken arm on a train platform to a shootout in the mountains. Thaddeus and Adelaide proved that sometimes the most broken people make the strongest team. If you loved this story of justice, gritty romance, and Wild West redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Did you think Adelaide would actually throw that Molotov? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story from the frontier. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next trail.